Welcome everybody to our Kidlit Distancing Social. And this week we have a great guest and a great topic. We're going to be talking about young adult with Dani Alcorn. So stick around for that. Laura will be along in just a minute with some things to celebrate and some of her publishing updates so you can find out what's going on in the publishing world. And let me just take care of a little bit of business here. So first, actually, well, let me first get to this. Let me share our screen. But I got something cool to announce to you today. But first, again, if you're new to us, if you're just here for the very first time, welcome. If you happen to maybe saw our Facebook link and what have you, we'd love for you to get on our list so that we can share every week what our topic is and also all sorts of the goodies that we send out. And the easiest and best way to do that is to also get a very cool free gift, which is our Ultimate Children's Writing Cheat Sheet, something we created to celebrate our 30th anniversary, which we officially celebrated on May 1st. The current issue of CBI is our 30th anniversary issue. So just go to writeforkids.org/ultimate-cheat sheet, and you can sign up for that. You can get that for free, and you'll be on our list to find out about all sorts of other stuff. Now, one thing I wanted to tell you about real quick. We are having a webinar, paid webinar, next week, and it's on a topic that I know you guys are going to love. So let me go ahead and show it to you real quick. I'm going to share my screen. And hang on a second here. Okay, this is going to happen on Tuesday, but it will have a replay, so you can always watch it. But we've been thinking about this for years. The hardest part often of writing a book is coming up with an idea, coming up with a good idea. And it is, I know something people have struggled with for a long time. Steve Swinburne is maybe with us right now. He's a regular on the Kidlit Distancing Social. Hi, Steve. He is also amazing at generating story ideas. He's got this cool process that he kind of shared with Laura. And we said, all right, we need to teach this to our people. So what's going to happen next Tuesday, it's going to be called How to Generate Amazing Story Ideas. And there's basically what you're going to see in it. It's going to really just make coming up with ideas so much easier, and also allow you to judge whether it's a good idea, whether it's going to work, how to move it to the writing phase, how to develop a hook around your idea, how to tweak ideas that aren't working. So it's really, really cool. You're going to get emails about it soon if you're on our list, probably tomorrow. And one thing is, it's going to then be recorded and go up permanently on Writing Blueprints for $67. But we do a pre-sale for people who see it live or get the replay for $47. So you'll be able to save $20. You get lifetime access and all the handouts and stuff. So anyway, that's coming. You check your email about that. It's going to be really cool. All right. Let me get back here and we'll get rolling. Okay, we're going to start with a poll. We know you guys enjoy polls and they're fun, and we got a really fun one for you today. So this one is, what character would you most like to pet sit? Hang on a second, it should be popping up real soon. Okay, there you go. So Harry the dirty dog, the pigeon who wants to drive the bus, Clifford the big red dog, Piglet who's already got a vote, Bad Kitty, and the very hungry caterpillar. Who would you like to hang out with and keep an eye on for an evening? Go ahead and vote for that, and we'll see the winner. It's neck and neck. Christina, go ahead and vote just go ahead and click the poll so your vote gets counted. She has one for Harry the dirty dog.
Awesome.
Here, just a couple more, 10 or 15 seconds. Some folks are still voting. It's coming right down to the wire. I'm not going to tell you which ones.
Oh, they can't see the results?
No, not yet.
Okay.
It's a nail biter. Okay, I'll do 10, 5, Ooh, it's 1 vote difference. 4, 3. If you really like Clifford the Big Red Dog, this is your time. That's all I'm saying. 3, 2, 1, and that's it. And now we'll share the results. Oh, this was a super close. And the winner, it's a little slow tonight. Okay.
There we go.
The winner by 1 vote, Piglet.
Piglet.
Piglet comes in first. You all want to pet sit Piglet.
That's who I would pick, Piglet. I think he'd be fun to hang with for a day.
Clifford, the Big Red Dog, just missed by 1 vote.
Clifford would be my second choice, yes.
The Pigeon, who wants to drive the bus, came in third. Harry, the Dirty Dog, came in next. And then the Very Hungry Caterpillar and Bad Kitty, who by the name of Bad Kitty should say why you would not want to pet sit Bad Kitty.
And the same way with the caterpillar, he'll eat all your plants, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
So.
I think you guys chose well. Okay, let's move on. And right now, I'm just gonna leave that up there, and I'm going to turn you over.
Go back one.
To Laura as we go back one. There we go.
All right. So, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us again. And as always, I see Dani says she can't vote as a panelist. As always, we start off with our celebrations. And so we have 3 great ones today. So Melba Gifford had her story Death Right win an honorable mention in the L. Ron Hubbard Writers of the Future contest in January, first quarter contest. And she recently sold a story called Forfeit to Cricket Magazine. So that's awesome. Cynthia Mcgrill Wetzler published her first middle grade novel, Witchy Magic and Me Maggie, with her independent publisher that she formed, Saltwater Press, in November. So congratulations, Cynthia. And Sharon Lucas used picture book blueprint from our writing blueprints to write her first picture book, Zoolympics, which was recently published by Castle Publishing in New Zealand. So congrats, Sharon. That is just awesome. And we're just thrilled for all of you. So as always, send us your good news. So I saw Vicky in the chat box earlier. This is where you want to email your good news to us. Mail at writeforkids.org and put celebrate in the subject line, and we will share it on our next distancing social. And no news is too small to share. We celebrate every little step you take. So good job, everybody. Okay, I have some fun, just a few publishing updates and links this week, because I gave you a lot last week. So go watch the replay on our blog from last week if you want to see a bunch of them. Sales-wise, what's really hot right now, what's really selling is craft books, activity books, do-it-yourself, you know, how to plant a vegetable garden, how to crochet, puzzle books, etc., both for kids and adults. And a lot of publishers are really, I mean, this is keeping their bottom line up, these activity books, because everybody's home, they got time on their hands, they want to learn how to do cool stuff. So if you currently have a book like that in this market, that's where I would put your promotional efforts right now on your social media, is really highlighting those titles. And if you're considering self-publishing such a book and you've got it in the works, I would say go for it, get it out, because again, there's a good market for it right now, especially if you have an ebook version of it. It's easy for people to get. And if you have a kid's book and, you know, even fiction, nonfiction, doesn't matter. If you can come up with some kind of activity guide to go with it, even if it's on your website and it's free, it might be a nice incentive for people to buy your book, because there are activities that you've created to go with it that kids can do that tie in with whatever your book's about. And they can be fun or educational or both. So I just wanted to put that idea out there. And then I have 2 cool links for the kids. You've got a lot of you have kids at home right now, and maybe some of them are young writers. So Barnes & Noble has just launched a national children's short story contest for young writers ages 6 to 12. And they're going to choose 15 winning entries from all the submissions they get, and they're going to publish them in an anthology that will be sold through Barnes & Noble this holiday season. So that's very exciting. And the deadline to enter is May 29th. So details are at this link that I have up here, and I know it's kind of a long, weird link. You might want to watch it on the replay to really get it. Or you could just Google Barnes & Noble Children's Short Story Contest and find the same information. And they can submit online. And so go check that out. And if you have young writers, some of you already know about this, but I wanted to remind you, or if you missed it, we have a young writer's blueprint that we are offering for free on our through our writingblueprints.com site. And that's a step-by-step online course for young writers ages 6 to 12. And really writers ages 6 to 10, but writers up to 12 can certainly get a lot out of it. And so if an adult has to sign up for it, but if you want to go check that out for your kids, have them go through that Young Writer's Blueprint. It's a short blueprint, and it was instructed by Alice Kuipers, who's an instructor on 2 of our other blueprints, and she's amazing. And she really walks young writers through how to create a story. And they might want to do that first and then write a story and submit it to the story contest. So created a bit.ly link for that. So it's bit.ly/YW Blueprint. And you can go check that out and have your kids write some amazing stories. So, John, I think we're going to do another poll.
Okay.
I don't know how to do polls. He has to do them. We got one more poll, and then we're going to talk YA.
This is my function at the company. All right. You want to read that one, Laura?
Okay, so which of these opening lines from a children's or young adult book is your favorite? And there should be, okay, I'll read the lines for you while you can vote. Look, I didn't want to be a half-blood. Where's Papa going with that axe? Said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. If you're interested in stories with happy endings, you would be better off reading some other book. In an old house in Paris that was covered with vines lived 12 little girls in 2 straight lines. On Thursday, when Imogene woke up, she found she had grown antlers. And finally, we went to the moon to have fun, but the moon turned out to completely suck. And when we have the results, I'll tell you what books these are all from. Some of you already know. All right. Oh, the votes are rolling in. I think I know what's going to win, but I'm going to save my prediction.
I believe Laura's favorite book of all time is going to win.
So there's a close second
yeah, there
on
is.
here.
There's someone
well, I mean, of my favorites, there's a close second on here too. I actually love all of the books that are up here. All right, so
another 10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Get those last votes in. All right.
All right, here we go.
It'll pop up in just a minute. Laura, you can, in the meantime, announce the winner.
Okay, Look, I Didn't Want to Be a Half-Blood is from Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan. Second one is Charlotte's Web, and that was the winner, and that is my favorite book of all time. Third one is from A Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket. Number 4 is Madeline, classic picture book. The fifth one, On Thursday, When Imogene Woke Up, that is Imogene's Antlers. That is probably one of my favorite picture books of all time.
Hang on, guys.
Oh, we didn't share the results.
Now it's sharing it.
Oh my gosh. And finally, we went to the moon to have fun, but the moon turned out to completely suck. That is a YA novel by M.T. Anderson called Feed, and it's actually a great book. But, well, we have a bunch of YA writers here today. So
it is YA night.
I'm guessing a lot of you know that book, and if you don't, you should read it. It's really good.
So am I done now? I've filled my purpose. I've run the poll.
For the moment, yes.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Okay. So now that we've had our fun, let's talk YA and have some more fun. So I would like to introduce Dani Alcorn. Dani, go ahead and turn on your camera and microphone. And I'm really happy to have Dani with us tonight. It could be that I can't, wait, let me stop sharing my screen, Dani, after I introduce you. I think I have to do that for you to show up. So hang on. I just wanted you all to see that she is an author. She writes YA, she writes screenplays. She is co-authored writing young adult fiction. And she is also the Chief Operating Officer, such a grand title, of Writing Academy, which is an amazing online resource for writers, both for adult and children. So I'm going to stop sharing here so we can see you, Dani. There you are.
Hello.
Hello. Can everyone hear Dani okay? Can you say a few words, Dani, and we'll make sure?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on tonight. I'm really excited to chat YA.
Speakers need to be turned up, please. John always has the speakers down low, and I can't hear you. I'm sure everybody else can hear you great. We got to turn up our speakers. Oh, there. Okay. Duh.
I am technical support and poll master.
Sorry.
Everybody needs technical support.
I have allergy brain today, literally. I mean, it's just like foggy. Okay, great. Everybody can hear. So welcome, Dani. Thanks for coming. I'm excited to talk YA with you today. I don't know if you noticed earlier, we have a lot of YA writers here today. So that's very exciting. We'll get to we've got several questions already in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those in a minute. But first I wanted to just kind of talk about a couple big topics that you and I had kind of discussed earlier. And one of them is the difference between plot and story. And I wonder if you could kind of define that for us a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So those words get used interchangeably. But for writers, I find that there is a very important distinction and a difference between them. That is one of the foundational things that I always start with. And essentially, it is the difference between the physical journey that your protagonist is on and their emotional journey of change over the course of your book. And this applies to literally any genre of fiction. And you can even apply the same concepts to creative nonfiction, biography, autobiography, things like that. Mm-hmm. You have this physical aspect of how the characters are getting from point A to point B and the stuff that's happening, the car chases, the, hijinks and everything that's happening. But then you also, on top of that, have the character growing and changing and overcoming, their fundamental character flaw, which then ultimately they're all tied together, of course. And so until you have that emotional growth, you can't complete the physical journey that the protagonist is on. So very, very simply put, plot is external and story is internal.
Right. Now, some people use the word theme. Is that something separate from story, or is that kind of the same thing as story?
I think about theme is separate from story, but the theme 100% emerges from the story. Mm-hmm. So as you're thinking about, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but as you're thinking about your character's arc over the course of an entire manuscript, at the beginning, they have some flaw. And the reason that they can't accomplish their goal is that they haven't overcome this flaw yet. Fast forward through many, many pages of your manuscript, when they've learned, they've grown, they've started to realize what their flaw is, they realize it, overcome it, and then are able to accomplish whatever it was that they really needed to at the beginning. That process, that epiphany of realizing the flaw and overcoming it, is the number one thing that reinforces the theme. And if you were going to boil the, when I say theme of a book, I'm talking very like fundamental kernel of this book is about love conquers all, or the importance of believing in yourself. There are probably only a handful of themes that kind of get told as stories over and over again. And then you can obviously add more nuance to those. And but yeah, that's how I see the relationship between story, plot, and theme.
Great. And as you said, that can work for certainly middle grade chapter books. I think even picture books. They're simpler. Like the character flaw, how the character grows is probably much simpler than certainly in YA, but you're going to have all of those elements as well in a picture book. Yeah,
I think with the thing I've observed with children's books, picture books in particular, is that you absolutely can apply the same techniques and the same framework of thinking to them. But as you say, sort of the appropriate themes, the appropriate flaws are different.
Right.
One that I think the most common story structuring flaw, certainly in young adult literature, but I would actually venture to say that in almost any genre you can think of, the most common story structuring flaw is lack of self-confidence, because it resonates with everyone at all stages of life. So that's probably the one that you'll see from the teeniest of picture book for the toddlest of toddlers all the way to, your literary fiction.
And what's interesting about something like that, it's such a universal emotion and, flaw, obstacle that we all face, but it can manifest in so many different ways, which is why we have so many different stories.
Exactly.
So it could be afraid of the dark as a little kid, but when you're talking YA, it might be, standing up against racism, or something big that they have to do. So yes, it's very universal, but can be changed and manipulated in many different ways for whatever your story is saying. Sorry, allergy brain. So we've got, the plot, the story, and obviously you need a protagonist to plug into this. What are some of your tips on YA protagonists, creating them?
So YA is the genre that is nearest and dearest to my heart for a lot of reasons. But one of them, I think, is that I love young adult protagonists, because when they're done well, young adult really is in the middle of a renaissance in terms of the number of books that are published, the quality of the books that are published, and the fact that adult readers are starting to gravitate and read young adult as well. And so I think when you're beginning to think about your protagonist in the young adult category, one of the first things to consider once you move past their character flaw, their obstacle, that's the fundamental pinning of the story that you're going to tell. But once you begin developing this protagonist that is going to inhabit this world that you're creating and the story that you're dreaming up, I think one of the first things that you need to consider is the age. In my experience, most young adult readers want to read books about people who are 1 to 2 years older than they are, as kind of a nice rough rule of thumb. And so on the upper end of that, it can get a little bit compressed, because in young adult literature, you tend to sort of have the oldest protagonist you would find would be seniors in high school, maybe first year of college. But I also think this is touching on something related, but it's been interesting to see as more adults want to read young adult fiction, this kind of emerging category of new adult, where then that's where they tend to get into their early 20s. But other than that, I think that 2 year kind of older is a great benchmark. So I think that that's one of the things that can be a pitfall, is that people assume that the character should be the same age as their target demographic, their target reader that they want to reach. But actually, especially precocious kids who are likely to read your books, you know, they want to be, what's next? They're looking ahead. And that's what I love so much about young adult fiction, is that just being a young adult is such a time of exploration in terms of you're deciding who you're going to be, you're trying on different personalities, and books give you as a reader a way to slip into someone else's life and kind of see what fits and what resonates and what doesn't. And so again, that slightly older, what comes next, I think is the gateway that a lot of people have into it. So that's one of the most important things to consider as you're coming up with your basic protagonist, is, you know, the age. And then obviously another thing to consider is the gender of your protagonist. And again, who your target audience is. I think, well, my impression is that there are more girls out there who are reading young adult books, but that it is equally likely that they want to read a book about a female protagonist as a male protagonist. I think it all comes down to the story. I think that people put a lot more emphasis on aligning those than they really need to. From a marketing perspective, maybe it's a little bit harder to get male teenagers to read books about female teens, but there are so many counterexamples that when people are worried about that, I usually tell them not to, that their book is going to resonate with their readers for reasons other than the gender of the protagonist.
Yeah, look at the Hunger Games, for example. I mean, yeah. So it very much depends on the story, I think. And I think you, as a writer, you should write the protagonist who speaks to you and not worry about marketing, you know, not worry about, oh, is this going to appeal more to boys or girls? You have to write your story and not worry about that down the road, who's going to read it. Yeah. And I think what you said about age, it's the same with middle grade. You know, they want to read about a year or two older. And we had a question early on. Someone asked, you know, my protagonist, something about that 11 to 13 age, the characters, and I might come across the question again here in the Q&A, but I remember seeing that. And this person was wondering, is that middle grade or YA? And there's often discussions on Kidlit message boards about, where do I put my 14-year-old protagonist? Is it middle grade or YA? And that's a tough one. And we don't see a lot of 14-year-old protagonists for that reason, because I think it could go either way. And I think it just very much depends on what's happening in the story at that point and what the protagonist is facing, whether it's going to be considered middle grade or YA. And in your experience, what's generally about the youngest that a YA character can be?
The youngest that a YA character, at that age range, I would say 13. And again, it depends on, that could go either way. So it sort of depends on what's happening in the story. I can think of some examples of books with, you know, 12, 13, 14-year-old protagonists that, depending on, like one that I would throw out, Lovely Bones. If I remember correctly, I think she's 12 or 13, but that's a very dark and complex book. So I would put that in the sort of young adult category. But then there are, you know, sort of the set in middle school stories for characters that age that I think would fall more in the middle grade. It has to do with your protagonist and how they interact with the situation as well. Young adults, this is another pitfall to avoid if you're writing a young adult character, is that I think some people don't honor the fact that young adults are young adults. They're beginning to make decisions the way that adults do, and to think through their decisions the way that adults do, in the way that precocious middle schoolers do, but isn't quite the same, you know, sort of the think first, act first kind of dynamic there. So the number one thing I tell people about YA protagonists is that never, ever be condescending to your protagonist or your readers like you know more than they do, because that is the fastest way to make a reader put your book down. And teens are really good at seeing through that. Like they're in a phase where they want their independence, they want to start doing these things, and so you better honor that in this character that you're creating. And sure, they're going to mess up, and they don't necessarily have the perspective of an adult, but the thought process is the same.
Right. Yes, that's a really good distinction. Middle grade characters tend to react and then think and then go, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Whereas YA characters can anticipate more the consequences, and they might still make the mistakes. You know, they might anticipate wrong what's going to happen, but they're at least trying to think it through a little bit. Right. And that is an important distinction. So basically getting back to that 11 to 13, is that middle grade or YA? I would say that's a middle grade. And really in middle grade, I think that the upper age of your characters is generally 12. You can sometimes get away with 13 if it's a middle grade type story. If your character is set in high school, it's going to be a YA, because middle grade is really for kids in middle school or younger, the upper end of elementary school. So I always tell people, think about that librarian at the middle school. Is she going to buy a book that's set in high school? Even though some of her students can handle it, a lot of them might not. And is she going to want to put that on the shelf? So that's kind of the designation there, I think.
Yeah, and I think just for practical reasons, you're talking about contemporary settings as well. That 15, 16, 17 is sort of the sweet spot for YA in terms of independence, you know, whether that's driving or being able to take public transit, you know, or whatnot. I think that's kind of why you see that. And then you see also on the older end of the spectrum for kids who are getting ready to go off to college and are kind of preparing for that next stage of decision making.
Yeah. YA characters tend to spend way less time with adult supervision than the middle grade characters do. And again, it's because they might have a job, they can drive, they're just on their own more. And so they can be sort of out in the world more on that adult level than a middle grade character can be. Yeah.
The other thing that I just love about young adult fiction to write and to read is the authenticness with which the characters are approaching these decisions. Because as adults, we gain some perspective that not every single decision is life-changing. But as a young adult, even simple things like who you're going to sit next to at lunch feel like they are more important, because it is either the first time that you're making a decision like that, or the consequences seem so much more immediate and larger without that kind of perspective. And if you do that right, it is so compelling to kind of slip into someone else's skin, remember what it was like to go through all of those things for the first time and be making decisions about who you're going to be as a person.
I remember you emailed me something about that. And I was thinking this morning, I remembered back, you know, high school, the first day of each school year, you spent all summer planning your outfit, because it was like, what I wear on that first day is going to cement my social status for the year. So it has to be just right. And of course, people didn't remember a week later what you wore the first day of school, but to you, it was like the most important thing. You had to get it right because it was this lasting decision. And it's true. It's like, that's the way young adults, when they're approaching something for the first time like that, it has this weight about it. Even though as an adult, we can look back and go, who cares, you know? But they haven't gotten there yet. They don't have that perspective. So let's get to some questions here. Okay, so we already talked, Michael asked about, is it better female or male perspective? The little synopsis here is senior protagonist trying to prove father innocent of a crime. So that sounds like a really substantial plot there. Doesn't matter if it's female or male perspective. I think that there's a lot of decisions that go into that.
Yeah, I would ask questions about other themes that you want to explore in that, because certainly in the YA, the other thing about YA is that basically nothing is off limits. It can be as hard hitting as you want. Teenagers are ready to talk about isms, whether it's racist.
Oh, she froze for a second there.
I think from sort of a more enlightened perspective than we can as adults, because there's a little less baggage there. So I would ask if there are things that having a female or male protagonist will bring out of that situation, that you would want to explore and you would want to play with, and kind of ask some of those big questions.
And I think as a writer too, you have to decide, are you most comfortable writing in that female voice or male voice? And you might try it both ways, try a chapter both ways and see what feels more natural to you.
And I also don't think that they're as different as sometimes people assume they will be.
Right.
Especially if you're in a first person perspective, we all sort of think the same. So, or we think differently, but it's not a gendered thing.
Yes. No, I agree with that. I completely agree with that. Okay, what kind of trends do you see for contemporary YA? What about mashing up genres like contemporary and fantasy?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I was actually kind of pondering this recently myself, because I think 5 years ago, if you'd asked me this question, I would have said that young adult mashed up genres much more than adult literature. But I'm seeing more and more of that in adult literature, of the fantasy, romance, mysteries, and things like that. And I think I've kind of taken a page from YA in that respect. So I think you still absolutely can do those mashups. In terms of trends for contemporary, I think we're going to see a lot of pandemic literature.
Probably, yes. Yep. I think just in my keeping track of kind of what agents are looking for, the mashup of genres is very big. I mean, that's how you get new ideas. And they're loving that. Combining genres in creative ways, I think, is very big right now for YA. And certainly anything that brings diversity into it, whether it's a setting, the characters, the culture, whatever, is very much in demand right now. And again, you have to make sure that you are being very factual and authentic and sensitive to whatever you're bringing into it. But that's very much sought after. My feeling is there's going to be a big market for humor coming up, because we're all in a place where we need to laugh. And so I think anything coming out of this that's funny is going to be great. It's going to get snapped up pretty quick. That's just my opinion there.
I wonder also if we're going to see some changes, because I do feel like the transition to, being picked up as a movie or a TV show, I think has been driving some of the books that are getting picked up as like the biggest,
right.
Marketing pushes by publishers and things like that. But the, COVID-19 is obviously going to dramatically impact television and movie production for the foreseeable future. So I also will wonder if we're going to see maybe that trickle into having an effect where things don't need to be able to easily be translated to the screen quite the same way.
That's a really good point. Yeah. So just give us a brief, because you're also a screenwriter. So just a real brief definition of what kinds of books tend to get translated to the screen.
Very visual books get translated to the screen, and I'm sure you can see that there's a really obvious reason why. That as a screenwriter, you have to get very creative to show the internal monologue, internal dialogue, internal conflict. I mean, that's what good screenwriting is figuring out how to externalize that. But if you have a visually compelling world, if you have a lot of action, I mean, there's a reason Game of Thrones, you know, that kind of visual masterpiece kind of gets picked up. Yeah. So in a nutshell, that's.
And those had such, you know, the world building was so fantastic. Even we talked about the Hunger Games, Divergent, all these YA series that have been translated to the screen. A lot of it has to do with the world building that they created, the authors created. But I agree with you. I think there's probably going to be more room, at least in the next couple of years, for stories that are more internal, because you're right. The movie studios are going to have to play catch up as well. And they probably already have books that they've optioned that they haven't started production on yet. They're going to have to do those first before they start optioning new books. So that's a really good point. Okay. Jessica says, it seems that much of YA is dialogue driven. For example, the Twilight series she uses as an example. Is that obligatory? Excuse me. What do you think, Dani?
That's an interesting question. I mean,
it is.
I am also a screenwriter. Mm-hmm. So dialogue is one of our biggest tools. Mm-hmm. So I am a big fan of dialogue. I'm currently racking my brain trying to think of an example of a young adult book that isn't dialogue driven, and I feel like it's one of those things where if you ask for a recommendation, I've instantly heard of no restaurants.
Right, exactly. Oh, I same thing happens to me. I think that, you know, dialogue is such an important part of character development and creating relationships between characters, and that is so important in YA. Your character doesn't exist in a vacuum. They're in, you know, they have relationships, whether they're romantic or friend or family, and a lot of those relationships are going to create some of the tension in the book. And so the dialogue is important to develop those relationships, and also creating that internal dialogue of the character really helps the reader connect to the character and identify with the character. So I think dialogue is certainly a very important part of any story. Obviously, if you were to read books that are more action-based, very plot-heavy books, and really break down how much dialogue versus narrative, you would probably see that, you know, it's maybe 50-50, whereas if you have a story that is more emotionally driven, the dialogue is going to maybe be 70% of the book. So it just kind of, a lot of it depends on what type of story you're writing as well, I think.
And in YA too, another thing that I will throw out there is that it depends on what you classify as dialogue. Mm-hmm. With the increase in technology, many of the contemporary YA novels that I have read recently rely heavily upon emails, text messages, right, and other forms of communication. Mm-hmm. I would still consider those a form of dialogue in terms of the way that you're capturing the characters' voices and the way that they're expressing themselves. Mm-hmm. But it's not verbal dialogue anymore.
Right.
But yeah, dialogue too does so much within a story in terms of it is a source of conflict. It is a source of character revelation. So unless you truly have a situation where there is not going to be dialogue, it's mm-hmm. difficult to imagine how it could not be an integral part of the storytelling, unless right. it's something like Hatchet, where there's no one to talk to. But even then, there's internal
Even thoughts. Then, he had internal dialogue. He had flashbacks where he remembered his conversations he'd had with his parents. I think a book with no dialogue, it feels thin. It doesn't, it's hard for you to connect emotionally, like I said, with the character. But remember, good dialogue doesn't just sit on the page as dialogue. It does several things. It advances the plot. It shows you, like I said, the relationship between characters. It gives you insight into who's speaking. The reaction of the other character gives you insight into who they are. So there's a lot of layers to every dialogue scene. And it's not just a conversation to talk.
Right. There's never chit chat. There's
Right.
never chit chat in a book. There's never chit chat in a movie. The dialogue is always accomplishing something.
Right, right. So Jane says, how do you determine whether what you're writing is YA or young adults? And you mentioned the age of the character, and also young adult tends to be, the characters tend to be about 18 to 25, somewhere in there. And they are usually, you know, out of high school, and they're kind of moving into the first phase of their adult life, whether it's college or their first job or their first big romantic relationship. And I think that those are kind of the main differences, but do you see any other differences with new adult versus YA?
As I said, I don't think that really anything is off limits in YA. So, I mean, you can have pretty explicit sex, you can have, you know, kind of the grittiness that you want. I would say that new adult probably has a little bit more of that, just because it tends to be more of a part of young 20-somethings lives than it does necessarily teenagers. I think generally teenagers are having way less sex than everybody thinks they are, which I always enjoy when I have a book that acknowledges that. So yeah, I think it's what, and also just the way it's handled, you know. Again, is it the first time, in which case it's going to be this really big deal, whereas sort of the firsts in that new adult are a little bit different, you know. It's a little less experiential in terms of the firsts, and more in terms of deciding, you know, where you're going to college or what you're doing with your life, that are kind of taking that next step of your development. It's like you've kind of become the person you're going to be, and now you got to figure out how that person is going to interface with the world and what your place in it is. Right.
Yeah, young adults are on the threshold to adulthood. They often, by the end of the story, they have walked through that door for the first time. New adults are in adulthood in the beginning of it, and they're looking at it going, okay, here's how I'm going to be a grown-up now in some way. And again, they're going to make mistakes. They're not necessarily going to get it right, but they are seeing themselves more as adults maybe than YA characters do, at least at the beginning of their journey.
I would say that young adult is about who am I, and new adult is about how am I.
Okay, I like that. Yes, that's great. Okay, this is a submission question I can answer real quick. Marcia asked, when writing YA historical fiction, does the author include a bibliography with the synopsis and query when you are submitting to editors or agents? No, you don't have to with your initial query. The editor or agent might ask you for that if they request the full manuscript. So you should have that ready to go, but that is not necessary with your query letter with historical fiction. How many pages does a YA novel have to be? This question used to be much easier to answer.
I usually answer in terms of word count rather than pages, just because it's easier. You know, it doesn't depend on your font size or anything like that. And I mean, you can find guidelines from publishers and things like that. And I think that if you are querying a traditional publisher, you need to look up what their definition and their guidelines and make sure you're within those. If you're self-publishing, I mean, the sort of broadest range for novels, I would say, is like even as low as 60,000 up to 100. More than that, and you're getting lengthy. But you know,
some publishers even say 40,000 for YA. Basically, if you're less than 40,000 words, I think it's going to feel thin, except if you're doing a really unusual format. If you're writing I have a friend who wrote a YA novel that is all Post-it notes that a daughter and a mother left for each other on the refrigerator. Obviously, that's going to have fewer words to it, even though it has a substantial storyline. So take that into consideration if you're playing around with creative formats like that. I think the story needs to be as long as it needs to be. to tell the story, really.
Yeah.
It's less rigid than it used to be as far as word count, I think.
Very roughly, I would say, though, that there's probably an increase in word count with the age of your protagonist, just because there's also an increase in attention span. So
For
yes,
sure.
I think to your point, the post-it note thing is brilliant, and that's going to have fewer. But generally, if you're thinking of a traditional novel,
Yes.
your 14-year-old protagonist is going to be on the lower end, and your 18-year-old protagonist is going to be on the higher end.
Exactly.
If you're ballparking.
And often genre fiction like fantasy sci-fi goes longer just because you've got these complicated worlds that you're building, and they just need more time to do that. Okay. Let's see. Oh, Vicki Thomas says she loves your library, Dani.
Oh, thank you.
I know, isn't that amazing?
I built the bookshelves myself.
Ooh, very nice. So should a YA protagonist be a character that a reader can identify with? So should they be sympathetic? And I did want to talk for a minute about antagonists as well. So why don't we wrap this into that discussion?
Yeah. So the first thing that I will say is that a protagonist does not have to be the good guy, nor does the antagonist have to be the bad guy. And in fact, if you go all the way back to, what it means in Greek, pro just means working for something, and anti means working against something. So all that relationship really boils down to is two characters who are working at cross purposes to each other. That said, even if your protagonist is not a good guy, sometimes, in screenwriting we call it the anti-hero or something like that. However, if you do that, they still need to be sympathetic. They don't have to be good, but they have to be sympathetic. Otherwise, the reader will have no incentive to continue reading.
Right.
But it is often fascinating to read about people who are not that great people, but there's still something. I mean, the example that I throw out is for anybody who watched the TV show House. The main character of that, classic anti-hero, always curmudgeonly, always doing bad things, and yet he'd do a good thing, but then claim that it was for some selfish reason. And so you were constantly, as a viewer, wondering, well, is he really this much of a jerk? Or, is the heart of gold buried under there? And so that sympathy is what keeps people interested in your protagonist.
Right, exactly. So you don't have to identify with them in that, oh, they're just like me, but you need to kind of see either something to care about them, or kind of understand why they are who they are.
Exactly.
Yeah. John and I often talk about that with Tony Soprano from the old Sopranos. This is not a nice guy, but just when you thought, oh, I can't stand him, suddenly you would feel sorry for him, or he would do something kind, and it just kept you guessing as to who this guy was, and kept you glued, I think, to the series.
Yeah. People who have like a very strong code of personal ethics, even if it goes against what the rest of us would consider good ethics, I find very compelling. And that's often a way where, it's a window into the empathy you feel for this person, even if you don't identify with them as such. Yeah, I think that those are also words that sort of get, tossed around, but it's, whether you can empathize with the character is different than whether you identify with them.
Right. And I think for young adult fiction, that is really a great learning experience for the reader. If they are presented with a character who's very different from them, and not someone who they would normally meet in their everyday life, and they develop empathy for this character, I think that opens minds in an incredible way. And so I think writers should not be afraid to write those kind of characters. I think it can be very appealing.
Yeah, one book that I would just love to shout out, just because I think it is incredibly well written and should be required reading just for everybody, but The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas.
Yeah.
I mean, that character I basically share no life experiences with, and yet that was one of the most educational and powerful books I have read in recent memory.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. So the antagonist then doesn't necessarily have to be an evil person.
Exactly.
They're just working at odds. They're at odds with the protagonist. They're pushing against the protagonist in some way.
Yeah, they are preventing the antagonist from accomplishing whatever the antagonist wants or needs to, and ultimately are defeated in the end by something that is specific to the antagonist. So the way that I usually teach this is that the protagonist has a flaw and the antagonist has a flaw. And at the end, the difference is that one of them has recognized and overcome it and the other one has not. And so often you'll find that the flaws are either the same or opposite of each other, because that creates a very strong relationship between the two. So you see one triumph and one fall. And I think another thing is that the antagonist also, like, the defeat of the antagonist is commensurate to the stakes of the story. So, you know, in your huge action, adventure, thriller, adult novel, maybe the antagonist does get killed in the end. But that's, you know, the bully could also get put in detention at the end. That's, you know, that is a defeat of the antagonist commensurate to the stakes. And the antagonist can also be rehabilitated. That's very powerful in a lot of, especially middle grade, but I also think young adult literature, to see the character who has been wrong the whole time also realize that, and at the end change as well. And you find also in romances, many times one of the main love interests is acting as the other's antagonist the whole way through. And of course, there's a rehabilitation so that you get your happily ever after.
Okay, we just got time for one more question. I know you have a lot of great questions here, but I don't want to keep Dani all night. So I'll wrap two questions into one, because we had a couple. So first of all, we had a question on first or third person point of view. What do you see as more common? Is there a preference? You know, what do you think about that, Dani?
Personally, I am a big fan of first person viewpoint. And I think that also first was more common in young adult literature, and that has now also trickled into adult literature. I think it's very compelling. I think that in terms of being able to really get inside a character and experience the way that they experience the world, it's very good. And I think that also it's a great way. I actually find it easier to write first person. And I think that a lot of beginning writers actually, once they get into it, it clicks and they realize, and it's much harder to make viewpoint errors when you're learning. So I often suggest that people start a first person manuscript, even if they ultimately end up transitioning to third person. I think that the craft elements are actually a little bit more challenging in third person than they are in first person.
I agree. It's easier to stick with the consistent point of view in first. I think if you're writing one of those protagonists who's maybe not the nicest person, you really have to be all in with your character, because if you're writing in their voice, I imagine it would be easy to kind of make them a little nicer than they really need to be.
Yeah. And the kind of character that it doesn't work for either is that if it requires keeping a secret from the reader, it can feel very contrived in first person if there's just, you know, you're inside their head and they just happen not to mention this giant plot point.
Unless they're mentally unstable, like in I Am the Cheese, Robert Cormier, that was like the quintessential unreliable narrator, a classic YA. So, but yes, I agree. And then the last question someone asked was, how do you keep your adult sensibility out of the text when you're writing in YA?
Well, the easiest thing, number one, read a lot of young adult fiction. Read a lot of good young adult fiction. Get that feel for the way that young adults think and feel and react. And I think that's the number one way to sort of put yourself in there. But also, even if you don't share direct experiences with your protagonist. I mean, technology is changing so fast that, you know, a teenager now is growing up in a very different world than a teenager even 5 or 10 years ago. And so while you have to be cognizant of the changes in technology and the changing way that teenagers are relating to one another and interacting with one another, fundamentally, those feelings you had as a teenager when you were doing these things for the first time, that's still what everybody is going through. And if you just make sure that you are not passing judgment on your characters and their lack of experience or perspective. You got to lean into that lack of experience and perspective, and just really honor it and treat it as something that is, while something that we all hopefully grow out of, is a part of all of our journeys. And if you can tap back into that, you will write some really exceptional YA fiction. And if you need a final test, give it to a young adult and a red pen, and I guarantee they will tell you all of the places where you were being condescending. So
yes, absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's so key. Remember that these characters are doing whatever they're doing for the first time. And you, from your adult perspective, might know how that could turn out, but they don't. So you have to let them figure it out on their own. And if you can do that, I think then it will be very believable. You won't be, imposing your adult experience onto your characters. Well, Dani, this was great. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Wonderful information here. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I hope you learned a lot. And stay tuned for an email from us next week for our next distancing social, and it will be on Thursday next week. And watch for that email in your inbox tomorrow about our ideas webinar if you're interested in signing up for that. So thank you all and have a good evening.
Good
Bye.
night.
Bye.